In the winter of 1811, something happened in the middle of America that still sounds impossible today. A river flowed backward. Not for a second, not for a minute, for hours. Boats spun in circles on the water. Waves rose up where there should have been calm, flat river. And more than 1,000 miles away, in a city called Boston, church bells started ringing all by themselves. Nobody pulled the ropes. Nobody touched them. The ground did it. This did not happen in California. It did not happen near an ocean or a coastline. It happened in the quiet farmland of Missouri, in a tiny river town called New Madrid. Most people had never even heard of the place before that winter. After that winter, they never forgot it. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. Scientists say this could happen again, not in some far-off fantasy. In real life, maybe in your lifetime or in the lifetime of someone you know, right now there's a giant crack running deep under the ground in the middle of the country. Millions of people live directly on top of it. Most of them have no idea it is even there. So how did a quiet farm town turn into the site of one of the most powerful earthquakes in American history? Why did the ground crack open, swallow forests, and send a river running the wrong way? And why are scientists still watching this exact spot every single day, more than 200 years later? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something about the ground under your own feet that almost nobody else knows. And if you live anywhere near the middle of the United States, what you learn today might change how you prepare for the future. Most people only think about earthquakes when they think about California. Shaking ground, cracked highways, the ocean, palm trees. Almost nobody pictures cornfields, small river towns, or quiet farmland in the middle of the country. That gap between what people expect and what actually happened here is exactly why this story matters so much. The most powerful earthquake sequence to ever hit the United States east of the Rocky Mountains did not happen where anyone was watching for it. It happened in a place people assumed was completely safe. And the scientists who study this ground today will tell you that same assumption is still the biggest danger of all. Before we get into the wild story of what happened in 1811, hit that subscribe button. Here is why it actually matters this time. Later in this video, I'm going to show you the real numbers scientists use to guess when the next big one might hit. And there's a part near the end that could affect you directly if you live anywhere in the middle of the country. This is not a one-time story. Scientists study this ground every single day, and new information comes out often. If you want to know the moment something new is found, subscribing is the only way you will see it. So tap that button now, and let's get into the story. 3 nights that changed the land. To understand why this quiet ground is still being watched today, you have to go back to the exact nights when everything changed. The first big shake hit on December 16th, 1811. It was about 2 in the morning. Most people in the area were sound asleep in their beds. There was no warning at all, no rumble in the distance, no animals acting strange for hours before it happened. The ground just started to move, hard, in the pitch-black night. Scientists believe that first quake was somewhere between a strong 6 and a massive 8 on the power scale they use, with most estimates landing around 7.6. In simple terms, this was not a small tremor that rattled a few dishes on a shelf. This was strong enough to snap huge trees in half and tear the ground open in giant cracks. Just over a month later, on January 23, 1812, a second massive quake hit. This one struck around 9 in the morning, so people were awake this time, which almost made it worse. They watched the ground roll like ocean waves right in front of their eyes. This quake was almost as strong as the first one. Then, on February 7th, 1812, at about 3:45 in the morning, the biggest one of all hit. Scientists estimate this one may have reached close to an 8, making it one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the United States outside of Alaska. This is the one that made the river run backward. Here's what most people do not realize. Those 3 huge quakes were not the whole story. They were just the loudest moments in a 4-month nightmare. In between the big 3, this region was hit by more than 2,000 smaller shakes. In just the first 2 days alone, there were at least 6 aftershocks strong enough to badly damage buildings all on their own. The ground kept shaking, on and off, for more than a year afterward. Hundreds of smaller shocks were still being felt in 1813, more than 12 months after that first quake on that dark December morning. Imagine living through that. Not one bad night, but season after season of never quite trusting the ground under your own home. Every creak in a wall, every rattle of a window must have felt like the start of something worse. Families stopped sleeping inside their homes. They were too afraid the walls would come down on them in the middle of the night. Instead, they built simple shelters out in open fields, away from anything that could fall on them, and they huddled around fires through the freezing winter, listening for the next shake. Now let's talk about that river, because this is the part that sounds made up even though it is completely real. During the huge quake on February 7th, something wild happened along the Mississippi River. One of the deep cracks in the ground ran straight across the riverbed. When the ground on one side of that crack suddenly popped upward, it created a kind of wall under the water. almost like a speed bump made of solid rock. That sudden wall blocked the river for a moment and pushed the water backward, upstream, against its own current. Boats on the river that night were tossed around like toys in a bathtub. Some flipped over, some were smashed against the riverbank. People who survived it later said the water looked like it was boiling and that fountains of water and sand were shooting straight up out of the riverbed itself. That last detail was not only happening in the river, it was happening across the whole region. The ground here sits on a thick layer of soft, wet soil built up over thousands of years by the river itself. When violent shaking hits soil like that, something strange happens. The soil basically forgets how to act solid. It starts behaving more like a thick liquid, almost like quicksand. Underground water gets squeezed so hard that it shoots straight up to the surface, dragging sand along with it. Witnesses in 1811 said it looked like the fields themselves were bursting open, spitting out sand and water like broken fountains. Farmers were still plowing around these strange sandy patches decades later. The land itself was left scarred over thousands of square miles. Giant cracks opened in the ground, some wide enough to swallow a grown adult. Riverbanks collapsed straight into the water. And about 15 miles from New Madrid, something even stranger happened. A huge section of land actually sank down while the ground around it lifted up, and the low area filled with water almost overnight. That new lake is called Reelfoot Lake, and it still exists today in northwestern Tennessee. People fish there, people go boating there. Most of them have no idea that the lake under their boat did not exist before the winter of 1811. It was born in a matter of weeks, created by one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. Old tree stumps from the forest that used to stand there are still down under the surface of the water today. Somewhere, under all that calm water, there used to be solid ground with a forest growing on it, and maybe even a small community living nearby. It just quietly disappeared underwater in a matter of weeks, and today, most visitors paddling across that lake have no idea they are floating directly above a piece of American history that vanished almost overnight. So why don't more people know about this? Why isn't this earthquake as famous as the ones out west? The answer is almost too simple, and honestly a little chilling once you sit with it. In 1811, this part of the country was still frontier land. New Madrid itself was a tiny settlement with only a few hundred people. Beyond the town, there were scattered farms, river traders, and small communities. There was almost nothing built on top of this crack in the earth yet. That is the only reason the death toll from these earthquakes was not far worse. It had nothing to do with the quakes being gentle. They spared lives because there was barely anything there for them to destroy. Think about what daily life even looked like there in 1811. There was no warning system. There was no radio, no phone, not even a proper road most of the time. Families lived in small wooden cabins, often built by hand. Right next to the river they depended on for everything. When the ground started tearing itself apart in the middle of the night, these people had no idea what was even happening to them. Nobody in that region had a word for earthquake in their everyday vocabulary. Some settlers believed the world itself was ending. Survivors later wrote about a strange smell in the air after the biggest shocks, something like rotten eggs, which we now know came from gases pushed up through the broken ground. They wrote about total darkness, thick with dust, so heavy that some people said they could not see their own hands in front of their faces. According to old accounts from that time, at least one small settlement built on soft ground near the river sank so fast that people living there did not have time to escape. Word of what happened spread slowly back then, carried by boat and by horse instead of by phone or internet, and it took weeks for people in places like Washington and Philadelphia to even hear the full story. When they did hear it, many refused to believe it. A river running backward and bells ringing on their own sounded like something out of a tall tale, not something that could really happen on American soil. That single fact about how few people live there is the key to everything that comes next in this story, because the frontier is long gone now. Now that you know what happened back then, here's where it gets interesting. Scientists eventually figured out why this quiet farmland was capable of such violence in the first place, and the answer is stranger than you might think. Why this ground is so strange. Most people picture California when they think about earthquakes. Two huge chunks of the Earth's outer shell grinding past each other along the edge of the country, like two enormous puzzle pieces slowly scraping together. That kind of earthquake happens right at the edge of those pieces, and it is the kind most Americans have heard about their whole lives. The ground under New Madrid does something completely different, and for a long time, scientists were not even sure it was possible. This spot is not near the edge of any of those giant puzzle pieces. It sits hundreds of miles inside one of them, right in the safe, boring middle where earthquakes are not supposed to happen at all. Deep underground here, there's an old ancient crack left over from hundreds of millions of years ago, back when the middle of the continent tried to rip itself apart and never quite finished the job. That old wound in the earth is still down there, and every few hundred years, it seems to wake back up. Picture the middle of the country like a cracked windshield on a car. The crack does not run along the edge of the glass. It sits somewhere in the middle in a spot that looks fine most of the time, but hit that same windshield with just the right amount of pressure, and the old crack is exactly where it breaks first, even though the edges of the glass look far more obviously damaged. That is basically what is happening under Missouri and Arkansas. The obvious damage, the edges grinding together, is out in California. But the old hidden crack in the middle is still very much real, and it can still fail. Here's the part that makes this spot so much more dangerous than people realize, and it has nothing to do with how strong the shaking is right where it starts. It has to do with what happens to that shaking once it starts traveling. Think about the difference between hitting a solid metal bell with a spoon and hitting a pile of broken gravel with that same spoon. The bell rings out clean and loud, and you can hear it from far away. The gravel just makes a dull little thud, and the sound dies almost right where you hit it. The ground under California is a lot like that pile of gravel. It has been cracked and broken apart by millions of years of two plates grinding against each other. All those cracks act like little speed bumps. They soak up the shaking and scatter it, so a big earthquake in California tends to stay fairly close to where it started. The ground under the middle of the country is nothing like that. It is old. It is solid. It has not been chopped up by millions of years of plates grinding together. It is much more like that metal bell. When an earthquake happens here, the shaking does not get absorbed and scattered. It travels cleanly and efficiently in every direction for an incredible distance. Scientists have found that an earthquake here can shake an area roughly 20 times bigger than the same size earthquake would shake in California. 20 times bigger. That is the whole reason a crack in rural Missouri was able to ring church bells in Boston, more than 1,000 miles away. The exact same size earthquake happening on the California coast would have faded out long before it ever got anywhere close to that far. Now let's talk about just how much power we are really dealing with here, because the numbers get confusing fast if nobody explains them properly. Scientists rate earthquakes on a scale, and here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. That scale does not go up in a normal, even way. Each single step up the scale is not just a little bit stronger. It stands for roughly 31 times more energy being let loose. So an earthquake rated at 7 is not just a bit worse than one rated at 6. It unleashes about 31 times more raw power. Jump up 2 full numbers, and you are looking at almost 1,000 times more energy. When you hear that the 1811 and 1812 earthquakes reached into the high 7s and maybe even higher, you are hearing about an amount of raw power that is almost impossible to picture. Some scientists compare a single quake of that size to hundreds of the most powerful bomb blasts in human history, except that all of that force was dumped straight into solid ground in under a minute, spread out across an area big enough to touch dozens of states. Here is another way to think about it. Imagine a firecracker going off in your backyard. That is roughly what a small, harmless earthquake feels like. Now imagine that same backyard getting hit by a truck loaded with explosives instead. That is closer to what a jump of just 2 numbers on the power scale actually means. Most people hear the difference between a 6 and an 8 and picture something like the difference between a light rain and a heavy rain. In reality, it is closer to the difference between a firecracker and a truck bomb. That gap in power is exactly why the 1811 and 1812 earthquakes were able to do so much damage to the land itself, even in a place with hardly any buildings to knock down. So if the ground itself can produce this much raw power and can send it traveling incredibly far, why isn't every earthquake this size a total catastrophe? To answer that, we only have to look at one country on the other side of the world that has already figured this out. Japan gets hit by strong earthquakes constantly. It sits in one of the most earthquake-prone parts of the entire planet. And yet, when Japan gets hit by a quake in the same power range as the 1811 quakes, the result is often shockingly small. Sometimes just a handful of injuries. Sometimes nobody dies at all. That is not luck. That is decades of extremely strict building rules, buildings built to bend and sway instead of snapping and collapsing, early alert systems that give people precious seconds of warning, and a population that has been taught since childhood exactly what to do the moment the ground starts to move. In Japan, kids practice earthquake drills in school the same way American kids practice fire drills. Office workers know exactly where to duck and cover without even thinking about it. Skyscrapers are built with special systems inside them that let the whole building gently sway back and forth during a quake instead of cracking apart, almost like a tree bending in a strong wind instead of snapping in half. Japan proves something every country on Earth should pay attention to. How many people die in an earthquake is not really decided by the earthquake itself. It is decided by what people built and how ready they were in all the quiet years leading up to it. The ground under the middle of America is fully capable of producing the same kind of violent shaking Japan deals with regularly. The difference is almost entirely about preparation, not about geology. There's something almost eerie about that comparison once you really sit with it. Japan expects earthquakes, plans for them, and drills for them, and still loses very few people when a big one hits. The middle of America has a fault capable of producing the exact same kind of violence, but almost none of that same culture of preparation. The ground is not the problem. The gap in preparation is the problem. Hold on to that thought, because it is about to matter a whole lot more once we bring this story back to today, in the exact same spot where all of this happened 200 years ago. The sleeping giant under modern cities. Back in 1811, almost nobody lived on top of this crack in the earth. Today, that has completely changed, and this is where the story stops being history and starts being a warning. This underground danger zone now runs beneath parts of 8 different states: Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Mississippi all sit at least partly inside the danger area. Scientists estimate that around 11.5 million people now live close enough to be affected by a major quake here. That is more people than live in some entire countries. And these are not just scattered farms anymore. Real cities sit directly on top of this thing. Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, Little Rock, Arkansas, Evansville, Indiana, Paducah, Kentucky. Millions of people go about their normal lives every single day in these places, most of them with almost no idea that a repeat of 1811 is even a possibility, let alone something scientists actively plan for. Here is the problem. For generations, almost nobody built with earthquakes in mind in this part of the country. Because the last big one happened so long ago, it felt more like folklore than fact. Compare that to California, where builders have known for over a century that a major quake could hit any year. So newer buildings there are built to survive violent shaking on purpose. Much of the middle of the country never had that same wake-up call. Older buildings in these cities, especially the ones made from plain brick, were never built to bend or flex at all. In a serious quake, brick like that does not sway. It cracks apart and comes down. Think about how strange that gap really is. A person living in an older brick home in Memphis is sitting on ground capable of the exact same kind of violent shaking as a person living in Los Angeles. But the home in Los Angeles was far more likely to be built, inspected, and reinforced with that danger in mind. The home in Memphis probably was not, simply because nobody who built it 50 or 100 years ago was thinking about earthquakes at all. The ground did not get any safer over that time. The buildings just never caught up to the risk. The government agency in charge of disaster planning actually ran the numbers on this exact scenario, using a model based on an earthquake about the same size as the ones in 1811 and 1812. The results are hard to read without feeling a chill. Their model projects around 86,000 people either killed or injured. It projects more than 700,000 buildings damaged or destroyed across the region. It projects direct financial damage of well over $300 billion, with the full economic hit potentially reaching twice that once you count everything connected to it. And within just 3 days of the earthquake, the model predicts more than 7 million people would be forced out of their homes, with roughly 2 million of them needing emergency shelter right away. Try picturing that for a second. A number of displaced people larger than the entire population of many American states, all pushed out of their homes at the exact same time, in a region that has never once had to run a real disaster response on anything close to this scale. Memphis comes up again and again in these disaster planning reports, for a pretty grim reason. A huge share of its older buildings are made from plain brick that was never reinforced to handle serious shaking. In a major quake here, planners warn that a large portion of those buildings could become unsafe to enter or collapse outright. And it does not stop at buildings. Bridges crossing the Mississippi River, the ones this entire region depends on to move people, food, and supplies, would be at serious risk. Underground pipelines that carry natural gas into homes, water systems that keep the taps running, and power lines that keep the lights on all cross directly over this danger zone. When a strong quake breaks a gas line, it does not just cause an inconvenience. It can start fires. When it breaks a water system, firefighters lose the water they need to fight those exact fires. Each broken piece makes every other problem worse. This crack in the earth runs beneath the highways that move freight through the entire middle of the country. It runs beneath railroad tracks carrying grain, coal, and fuel. It runs beneath the pipelines that heat homes as far away as the East Coast. A major earthquake here would not just hurt the cities sitting directly above it. It would cut through supply lines that the rest of the country actually depends on, which is exactly why disaster planners do not treat this as a local problem. They treat it as a national one. There is one more piece of this puzzle that makes it even trickier. Out on the West Coast, some cities now have early warning systems. Sensors near the coastline can detect the very first faster moving part of a quake and send out an alert seconds before the stronger, more damaging shaking arrives. Seconds do not sound like much, but they are enough time to stop a train, shut off a gas line, or get under a sturdy table. The middle of the country does not have anywhere near that same level of warning technology set up yet, and most people living here have never practiced an earthquake drill in their life. So even if the shaking itself was survivable, the region would be responding to it mostly blind, with almost no head start and very little practice. Think about a city like St. Louis for a second. It sits right along the river, with older buildings downtown, major highway bridges crossing the water, and hundreds of thousands of people packed into a small area. Or think about Memphis, home to one of the busiest cargo airports in the entire country. A hub that ships everything from medicine to everyday packages across the whole nation every single night. A serious earthquake in this region would not just be a local tragedy. It could quietly disrupt deliveries, fuel, and supplies for people living nowhere near the danger zone at all. So, with numbers this serious, you are probably wondering the same thing everybody wonders at this point. Is this actually about to happen? Is a big earthquake here overdue? To answer that honestly, we have to look at something scientists are still arguing about right now, today, in real time. Is it ready to wake up? But there is something even more interesting going on behind the scenes. Serious scientists are actually split into two different camps about how dangerous this ground really is right now, and both sides have real evidence backing them up. Most scientists in this field land somewhere in the middle. They agree the ground here is not moving as fast as researchers once expected, but they also agree that thousands of years of buried evidence cannot simply be ignored. The overall consensus is that this remains a real, ongoing danger worth taking seriously, even if nobody can say exactly when the next one will strike. That is exactly why scientists keep sensitive equipment listening to this ground every single hour of every single day. Small earthquakes happen here constantly, hundreds of them a year, most too weak for a person to even feel. The ground is never actually silent. It is just usually too quiet to notice. It helps to think about this debate less like a disagreement and more like two different pieces of the same puzzle. One group is looking at what the ground is doing this year and this decade. The other group is looking at what the ground has done across thousands of years. Both pieces of evidence are real. They are just measuring completely different timelines, and that is exactly why the debate has not been settled yet. Even scientists who disagree with each other on the details tend to agree on one basic point. Nobody has found any solid proof that this fault has permanently shut down for good. Until someone does, the safest approach is to treat it as a real, ongoing risk, not a closed chapter of history. So here are the real numbers, straight from the scientists who study this the closest. Over the next 50 years, they estimate somewhere between a 25 and 40% chance of a fairly strong earthquake striking this region. And they estimate somewhere between a 7 and 10% chance of a full repeat of the massive 1811 and 1812 disaster in that same 50-year window. A 7 to 10% chance might sound small at first, until you remember what that chance actually represents. We are talking about an event that could injure or kill tens of thousands of people and force millions of others out of their homes. You would probably think twice about getting on a plane if someone told you it had a 7% chance of crashing. You would probably think twice about letting your kids cross a bridge if someone told you there was a 1 in 10 chance it might not hold. This is that same level of risk, quietly sitting underneath 8 states for years and years, while almost nobody around it actually prepares. And remember, that 50-year window is not a single roll of the dice that resets once nothing happens. Every year that passes without a major quake does not make the region safer. It just means the clock keeps running on the same long-term odds. That is part of why scientists keep studying this ground so closely instead of simply crossing it off the list of things to worry about. It also helps to think through simple things most people never consider until it is too late. Where would you go if you had to leave your home in a hurry with no warning? Do you have a way to charge your phone if the power goes out for days instead of hours? Do the older members of your family know these same steps? Or are they assuming this kind of thing could never happen where they live? Talking through these questions once, calmly, with the people you care about, is worth far more than panicking about it later while the ground is actually shaking. None of this requires living in fear. It just takes one afternoon of preparation, something almost nobody in this region has ever been told they actually need to do. The people of 1811 survived in the numbers they did mostly because there was barely anyone there to be hurt. The 11.5 million people living there today do not have that same protection. The only thing standing between a bad day and a full-blown disaster is what gets done now, quietly, long before the ground ever decides to move again. Think back to where this story started, a river running backward, bells ringing themselves 1,000 miles away, a tiny frontier town torn apart by something nobody at the time had a name for. It all sounded almost too strange to be real, but every part of it happened, and the same ground that caused it is still sitting quietly under millions of homes today. So here is the one thing worth remembering after everything you just learned. This fault does not warn anyone before it strikes. It does not smoke like a volcano. It does not spin up on a weather map like a storm you can watch coming for days. It just waits quietly, sometimes for centuries, underneath ground that looks as normal and safe as any farmland in America. Whether the next big one turns into a manageable emergency or a full-blown disaster will not be decided by the earthquake itself. It will be decided by what people do or do not do in the quiet years before it ever happens. If this story kept you hooked, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And I want to know something from you. Have you ever felt the ground shake somewhere you thought earthquakes could never happen? Tell me in the comments where you were and what it felt like.